Hello, good evening everybody, and welcome to this Wednesday webinar for World Horse Welfare. I'm just going to ask you all to bear with us while we wait for a few seconds to connect with Facebook Live. So today we have a fantastic webinar talking about how diet and nutrition affects behaviour. Have we got Facebook Live people with us? Yes, I think we have. Good. Welcome everybody. Welcome to this webinar from World Horse Welfare. I'm your host, Lucy Grieve. I'm standing in for Roly Owers, so some of you might have seen me 2 weeks ago at the last webinar. So welcome to everybody from Zoom and Facebook. As always, we're very pleased to see so many of you attend these live webinars. You can continue to support World Horse Welfare and ultimately horse welfare in many ways, with one easy way being to encourage your friends and family to attend or watch these webinars too. Anyone can register for free, which we feel is the best way to participate, but you can also watch live on Facebook and subscribe to our YouTube channel and watch back at a later date. Links should be available in the chat now. So tonight we're going to be talking about how you can promote positive equine well-being and behaviour through diet. Behavioural issues can manifest in a range of ways and due to many causes, and I'm sure those of you watching with experience in the equine world see a range of behavioural issues on a regular basis. So examining how feeding, a fundamental part of owning and keeping horses, may be able to positively influence the behaviour is bound to be insightful. Today, we're very pleased to welcome equine behaviourists Rosa Verwijs and Justine Harrison. A very warm welcome to both of you. Thank you for being here. This evening's webinar will include a presentation from Rosa and a discussion with both Rosa and Justine. And before we open up the floor to questions from the audience, want people to be involved, remember that this is a two-way conversation. So please use the questions and answer tab on Zoom. And if you're on Facebook, use the comments to ask questions and share your views. If you enjoyed today's discussion, please attend the other webinars we have coming up and share those with your friends also. So we welcome ideas for future topics. Let us know on chat or email at education@worldhorsewelfare.org if you have any topics that you'd like to see covered in the future. The next webinar is on 1st of February, and we'll be looking at targeted parasite control to take best care of your horse and the environment. And this webinar will be welcoming Claire Shand from Westgate Laboratories and will be accompanied by Vet Beaver President David Rendell. We'll place a link in the chat so you can sign up for that and look forward to seeing you there. So before we continue, it's important to note that this evening has not been designed around individual diet formulation for horses. If you have questions specific to your horse's wider diet, please make sure you get in contact with your vet and a qualified and registered nutritionist. It's important that your horse's health history feeds into your diet plan, so information from your vet can inform your nutritionist plan. Independent nutritionists can be found on the Association for Nutrition Register, and there's a link to that in the chat also, or you can contact a variety of feed companies. So I'm just going to share my screen and bring up a poll. And I'd like you all to have a look at this poll. So promoting, sorry, let's move these windows around. Promoting positive equine well-being oh, sorry, let me get the poll up, the poll question. Hang on. Before, we'd love to hear from you. There's a poll for the Zoom users. If you're watching on Facebook and you cannot take part the next time, please do sign up and take part on Zoom. There's no right or wrong answers in this poll, okay? So you get the right bit up. What is the maximum time a horse can be left without forage? So if you could all please see the poll pop up, you'll be given the options of under 4 hours, 4 to 8 hours, or over 9 hours. So if you could please all put down what you think. As we say, there's no right and wrong answers. And while you're doing that, I'm just going to introduce myself. So as I said, I did present a webinar a couple of weeks ago, which you might have seen me at. Basically, I've worked as an equine vet in Newmarket for 15 years. In 2012, I became a member of the British Equine Veterinary Association Council, where I chaired the Ethics and Welfare Committee, sat on the Equestrian Sports Committee. In 2020, I was the Beaver President, and I've since moved into a permanent role there as the Veterinary Projects Officer. And then I'd like to bring you on to our speakers. So first of all, we have Rosa. Hello, Rosa. Rosa is a senior lecturer in equine behaviour and nutrition at Writtle University College in Essex, where she leads the BSc Honours Equine Behavioural Science course. Rosa is a certified horse behaviour consultant with the International Association of Animal Behaviour Consultants, and she sits on equine industry behaviour and welfare committees for the Animal Behaviour and Training Council, the British Horse Society, and NUC, the National Equine Welfare Council. And she writes behaviour articles for equine magazines. So Rosa continues to understand horses, an education organisation. She's presenting a practical evidence-based information on the range of topics, including horse behaviour, training, nutrition, physiology and welfare. And then next up we have Justine. So Justine is a certified horse behaviour consultant with the International Association of Animal Behaviour Consultants. She's also the organisation's UK co-chair and a member of the application review team. Justine's also registered as an accredited animal behaviourist with the Animal Behaviour and Training Council and one of the organisation's trustees. She was recently awarded an honorary degree for distinction in the equine industry from Writtle University College. Well done, Justine. And she's the founder of Understand Horses. So next up, we'll have a look at the poll results. So we can bring that up. So we've got the results. So that's interesting. So 77% think under 4 hours is the maximum time you should leave your horse without forage. And then we've got 21% who think 4 to 8 hours and 2% think over 9 hours. So it'd be great to speak to you, Rosa and Lucy, about the rationale behind these and to try and help people to understand how they can make decisions about their horse's diet in relation to the horse's behaviour. So now we'll go over to Rosa's presentation. Rosa, you've got a half hour to give us your presentation and look forward to hearing it. Thank you, Rosa. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to thank World Horse Welfare for inviting me to speak tonight. I hope that everyone finds this interesting, and hopefully there's some useful practical tips for you for feeding your own horses as well. So to start off, we're going to be talking just through some basics of nutrition, just to make sure everyone's up to speed before I talk about some more principles, and then really focusing on behaviour. I'm a behaviourist. I do lecture in nutrition as well, but I'm not a registered nutritionist, so my knowledge in that area is not perhaps as good as those colleagues that are obviously have worked very hard and spent many years researching into the nutrition. The first thing I want to talk about is the behavioural needs of the horse. These are really important. We have to understand what our horses want. Just because we've domesticated them, we pop them in a stable and we want to ride them, doesn't mean that we should be able to ignore what a horse wants and what they need. Even throughout evolution, the horse's needs haven't really changed that much. They're a very social species. They like to live in groups. So as my colleague Lauren Fraser has coined it, the 3 Fs, and I've heard a lot of people talking about the 3 Fs now, so some of you might be familiar with this term, is really encompassing those core behavioural needs that horses have, which is to have friends, not be isolated, not be on their own, and be able to be in the company of other horses, to feel safe as well. Forage is obviously our focal point for today, and a lot of you will know that horses spend up to sort of 16 to 20 hours a day grazing if they have the choice to do so. That's a huge part of their day and should really tell you that food is super important to horses, and the option to be able to forage, search for and eat food is going to be probably their #1 priority. Freedom's also really important. And within freedom, we're not just talking about horses being out in the field, but we're talking about them having choice and control over what behaviours they are doing. If you want to know more detail about the 3 Fs, there's a link hopefully popping up in the chat, written by Lauren Fraser, called The Horses Manifesto, What Do We Want? Friends, Forage and Freedom. It's a nice 3-part document, which will give you some more information on that. So some basics on our nutrition is talking about the appetite of the horse. So this is looking at how much a horse might eat in a day. And generally we're looking at horses will consume 2 to 3% of their body weight. So if you've got a 500 kilogram horse, then that horse can eat about 10 to 15 kilograms of food a day. Now, you might be thinking that's loads, that's a whole sack of food, but a big proportion of that should be fibre. I've just put in brackets there on the second little bar on a dry matter basis. And that's also important to note because the different types of forage we feed have a different dry matter content. It basically talks about how much of the food contains all the nutrients and how much is just water. Now, obviously, water is important, but if we're feeding something like haylage, that can actually be around 50% water.
I know.
Whereas if we're feeding more of a hay, then we're looking at it being around 90% dry matter and only 10% water. So that's going to affect how much the horse eats. Grasses are generally around 20 to 25% dry matter. So horses will eat a lot more grass to get in enough dry matter to get enough nutrients, fibre and calories, which is why we have to take this into account, because if we just feed on a volume, if we just give a hay net of different types of forages, it might not be as satisfying to the horse as we think. And that can be where some of our problems stem from. The really critical point is that the minimum amount of fibre a horse should be eating is 1.4% of their body weight. So for that 500 kilogram horse, we're looking at 7 to 10.5 kilos. Now, this perhaps goes a little bit against the grain with some of you that have seen those rationing where we look at horses in different levels of work and it says horses in hard work should be on a 30% forage ration. By the way, when I say fibre forage, they're kind of interchangeable terms, so think the same thing. That racehorses or horses in very hard work should only get 30% of the diet as fibre, and they need 70% of that as concentrates. And concentrates generally represent starch and sugar and fats as well, which is actually probably why we see such a high proportion of performance horses with clinical issues that are caused by the feed that we give them. So we really need to work on maximising fibre. If you're starting a diet for a horse, obviously speak to your nutritionist, but hopefully they're going to come at it from a fibre first basis. An awful lot of horses, especially our leisure horses, companion horses, can do very well on a very high fibre diet supplemented by something like a balancer. And a lot of the balancers out there for leisure horses, stud horses, etc., will contain a balanced ration of protein, vitamins and minerals and not contain all the starch and sugar that some of those coarse mixes and pelleted feeds tend to offer. It can be a minefield. There are so many different feeds on the market, and sometimes just going off the name doesn't necessarily guarantee the type of nutrients that are in there. So do your research, look up what ingredients are in there, and have a look at the analysis that's on the back as well of the feed. So my scales diagram is really to say fibre needs to be the biggest proportion of your diet, should massively outweigh the other nutrients that you are thinking about. Naturally, a horse's diet would be typically 75% fibre. Most of the things that they eat are quite low in sugar and starch and in fats as well. To give you a bit more evidence of why horses should eat fibre, we can play detective. So if we have a look at the anatomy of the horse, we can have a look starting with their teeth and see that the horses have incisors, so the front flat teeth, which are really for biting off grass. They don't have the canines. We all know that horses aren't designed to eat meat. And there's that big, helpful gap where we can put a bit. But we've got an awful lot of premolars and molars. So a huge amount of these large teeth, which you can see there, which continue to erupt and grow down. So they wear down because the horse should be constantly grinding, these jaw sweeping movements of grinding down coarse grasses. And a lot of the grasses that horses are designed to eat and have evolved to eat would be typically quite low in nutrition. So horses should be eating a lot for a large proportion of their day to make sure that they can get enough calories in. Now, if we look at our grazing that we manage, that we routinely fertilize, we rest it, we harrow it, we poo pick it, we keep it in really good condition, and we sow it with specific types of grasses that are generally a lot higher in nutritional value. So a lot of horses can gain weight quite quickly from being out on pasture. And also these pastures are a lot softer. They don't contain kind of the amounts of silica, which think of silica as like sand, which is a really rough particle you would find in the more coarse grasses that would wear down the horse's teeth, which is why we need to see dentists quite regularly to make sure that our horse's teeth are appropriate, that they're in even layer, and that we don't have any hooks or waves that are stopping the horse from grinding very well. So there's your evidence from the teeth that it's all about the grinding of the coarse fibres. If we have a look at the gastrointestinal tract, you can see we've got 3 there. So the cow is not the same as the horse, which is not the same as the dog. In the lighter pink at the top, we're looking at what we call the foregut, so comprising the stomach and the small intestine. And you can see that in relativity, the horse's stomach's really small. We sort of say about the size of a rugby ball, and not designed to hold large volumes of food at any one time. Horses are trickle feeders. They shouldn't be fed meals once or twice a day. They should have access to food to constantly keep topping it up. And we don't want their stomach to be empty at any one time, because horses are constantly secreting hydrochloric acid in the lower region of the stomach, or the glandular region. And this acid is there to help start that digestive process. If the stomach goes empty for a while, that acid can move around the stomach and is one of the key causes of gastric ulcers that we see. On a comparative angle, the small intestine doesn't look very big. It's actually really quite long. I think for the typical horse, if you laid it back to back, would be about the length of 2.5 tennis courts or something like that. But it's long and it's very narrow, and food can pass through there really quickly. And everything in the foregut that's digested is your proteins, your fats, your sugars, and your starches. So because it's such a limited area, we have to feed very small amounts of that. The huge brown bit at the bottom, that's your large intestine, starting with the cecum, which is this massive fermentation vat. Food sits in there, and we've got huge populations of microbes. The microbiome is a really popular current area of research. People are trying to work out what's the ultimate balance, what bacteria do we need in there, what effect do those bacteria have on the rest of the immune system, and more importantly for me is what effect do those microbes and their health have on their behaviour of the horse as well. So we have to be really careful. You'll have learned the 10 rules of feeding. If you're changing your feed, make those changes very, very gradually, because those bacteria are quite specific to what they eat. And if we do a massive change of feed, we can upset the whole balance of the microbiome for those bacteria, which can cause an awful lot of health. So some big differences there. Dogs clearly not designed to eat huge amounts of fibre. Cows just looks confusing. They don't have 4 stomachs. They have 1 stomach, but it has 4 chambers. And they do all of that fermentation in that rumination technique, which is why cows belch a lot and produce a lot of gas. They also regurgitate and we chew and swallow it. So the efficiency of digestion is massively different between these animals. But just focusing on the horse, here's your evidence. 65% of that horse's gastrointestinal tract is designed to eat fibre. So that's really what we should focus on feeding. There are different benefits of feeding fibre and forage. So I've got some psychological behavioural benefits and also how it affects the horse's physiology. It's obviously a natural food source. It tastes good. Yeah, horses want to eat forage. They like it. We can do studies. We have had studies done where we've withheld forage and just fed them hard food, which you'd think horses would go nuts for, excuse the pun. And after a while, they're actually like, I really want some forage. I'm missing it. They'll push a button like multiple times to get access to that. So it shows their motivation and how hard they'll work for it. It meets their behavioural needs, which I've discussed. It helps fill that time budget. So a time budget is how much time horses allocate to different activities, behavioural activities within their day. And with feeding, that 16 to 20 hours, we're looking at around 65% of their day. It also satisfies a psychological need to chew. And that's a really important term. It's about horses thinking and knowing that they need to be chewing. We can give them enough food to meet their calorie intake requirement and how much energy they need for being a field ornament right up to a high level performance horse. But if that comes in the form of food that doesn't require much chewing, horses will continue to want to chew more and need to chew more. So that's also where we can see some problems. Chewing actually increases saliva production. So horses don't salivate necessarily when they think about food or see food. They actually need to be chewing to start that saliva production process. And saliva is super important, contains bicarb, which is an alkaline substance, which helps to buffer the acidity, so the pH levels in the stomach. The stomach's a very acidic environment. Saliva goes down there and can help to neutralize that. And that's going to help guard our horses against gastric ulcers. So the more chewing they're doing, the more saliva they're producing, the more saliva they swallow, the better their gut health's going to be. It can also help decrease stereotypy performance. It depends on the type of stereotypy. It depends on when we feed these horses as well. Some horses will, for example, with weaving and box walking, you'll see the rate of stereotypy performance increase in anticipation of food. And other horses that perhaps crib, you might see that cribbing increase whilst they're eating. And this is due to different mechanisms that I don't have time to go into tonight. More physiological benefits, slow release energy. So we're not getting a massive burst of excitability in our horses because these forages are low energy density. They need to eat quite a lot. Saying that, we have got some super fibers, things like alfalfa, sugar beet, and soya hulls, which have a really high calorific content and are rapidly fermented. So they can be quite comparable to some of the harder feeds that we might be using. We want to see a low glycemic response. This is talking about the sugar dump. So how quickly we produce sugar after digesting these forages. We want it to be gradual and throughout the day so we don't get these massive peaks and troughs. That's going to affect our horses' energy levels and their stamina, which is ideal for our leisure horses. It's also going to stop these horses having a corresponding insulin peak, which if we've got horses that are insulin resistant or have problems there, so horses that have had laminitis, EMS, PPID or Cushing's, those horses are a bit in the risk zone. So we want to be feeding them low glycemic feeds as well. It's good for the gut. So long stem forages helps peristalsis, is just that wave-like contractions that keeps food moving through the gut. It keeps everything moving and hopefully should reduce the risk of colic for our horses as well. So long as they're chewing enough, producing enough saliva, have enough fluids to remain hydrated as well. It fills them up. So horses feel full and they don't get hungry. I'm sure you all know what it feels like to be hungry, and I'm pretty sure our horses can get hungry too. And I love the fact that it's central eating for horses. So you want to keep your horse warm this winter, make sure that they've got lots of forage. It's thermogenic, which just means heat created. And for horses that we're perhaps concerned about that don't drink enough, eating fibre stimulates them to drink as well. And having fibre in the gut holds more water there. So it stops horses getting dehydrated in hotter weather too. I'm just going to talk a little bit more about chewing rates because, as I said, horses have a psychological need to chew. And I also mentioned about dry matter and water content of feeds. So this has a big impact on how long it might take horses to chew through a massive hay net or something like a forage block or even a small bucket of feed. It's going to vary. So horses will chew faster if they've not been fed for quite a while. Horses can chew faster. As you can see on the right, I've got that little graphic. So processed foods, so pellets, which is just very ground feed, shoved together and squashed into a pellet, soaked feeds made into mash, don't require a lot of chewing. Whereas where we start getting up to our long-stemmed fibres, and especially our dry fibres, they take a lot more chewing. If the horse is hungry and is very motivated now to get eating, he's going to chew a lot faster as well, which means he might not be chewing properly. He's not producing as much saliva as we could, and that's going to increase risk of choke as well. And the moisture content. So whether that is food that naturally has a higher water content or food that we've soaked or steamed, so steamed hay softens it, it means that it doesn't need as much chewing as well. So horses are going to get through that a little bit quicker, and things like haylage too. Those chewing rates, as I said, affects the amount of saliva produced. It affects how long it's going to take that horse to eat that food. And then that's going to affect feeding satisfaction as well. So there's quite a few considerations to make when it comes to choosing the type of fibre that you want to feed your horse. There are lots of different forage options. There are plenty of forages out there. You've probably got your favourites, and you might have bought a big barn full of hay, and that's what you're going to be feeding. There's quite a lot that you can do with that. The long stemmed fibres, so I mean like long bits of hay rather than short chop or chaff, are going to take much longer to chew. So I had a student do this dissertation where she wanted to know how long it would take horses to eat food if we give them exactly the same amount. So she weighed out 500 grams of hay, 500 grams of chaff, and 500 grams of high fibre cubes. And you can see from the graph that it took an awful lot longer to eat that same amount of hay. Now, you can argue that, yes, you're going to have a much bigger volume of hay than you would if you weighed out 500 grams of cubes. That's a really valid point, and that's kind of the point of this. Also, looking at the different calorie contents of these. You can get quite high energy content hay, you can get very low energy chaff, and you can get very low energy cubes. So even on a calorific level, we can still see that hay is definitely a winner here. There are also lots of different hay replacers. There's lots of things that have come out now that are quite fashionable and quite fun and designed to enrich your horse, give them a bit of choice and a bit of variety as well. They're all a really great way to add fibre. If they are a short chop, even some of those bricks and cubes that you can get, it don't always take very long for that horse to consume. So you might be spending a lot of money on things that don't necessarily satisfy your horse as much. So think about the different ways that you provide it and what's going to work best for you and for your budget. Restricting access to forage is a big area of concern. So many horses we're seeing are struggling with obesity, are maintaining weight very easily. It's testament to the fact that we take such great care of them, better veterinary care, better worming, better pasture management and control. Winter time comes, it's a bit harder to get out in that mud and in the dark and exercise sometimes, and we might have limited turnout. Unfortunately, in the UK, turnout is such a difficult area to be able to provide for all horses. And we've also got horses that might be on box rest and unable to go out for long periods of time or at all. Some of the methods that we might use to restrict our horses and try and control that grazing intake so that they're not consuming too much sugar and gaining weight are things like keeping horses in stables, only turning them out for perhaps 1 to 2 hours. We might be strip grazing as well, using grazing muzzles, starvation paddocks where we've got very little to no grass, or perhaps we put them on bark paddocks or sand paddocks, and a whole host of other methods that I'm sure you are all very familiar with. These can work really well when it comes to managing your horse's weight, but there are some potential negative consequences when we think about it from a psychological perspective. So horses that are spending more time in a stable, their friends are probably out. They're not used to spending so much time in the stable. They're going to get stressed. They're going to get frustrated. And a lot of people will put their horse in the stable for the day and give it no food so that when it goes out, that's the only food it gets. So now you've got horses spending an awful lot of time in a stable without any food, getting very hungry, getting very frustrated. That hunger and motivation increases. When you turn them out, they are going to gorge. All they are going to do is eat. And we've seen that bite rate will increase. So how frequently they're biting the grass, chewing rate increases. They're literally just guzzling food. And surprisingly, they can consume, I think it's up to sort of 50% of their body weight within a couple of hours. So restricting horses in this way isn't actually that beneficial because your horse is just going to absolutely stuff their face, increase risk of colic, so many other problems, and they're now not doing any other behaviours other than feeding their face. They're not engaging in social behaviour. They're not moving around in that lovely huge field that you've got that they could run around and stay fit on. They're just stuffing their face. So we're going to see more weight gain. It's going to backfire. So you're thinking, gosh, I'm hardly feeding my horse anything and doesn't get much turnout and he's just ballooning. And these are probably some of the reasons why. We're going to see other health issues as a result of that as well. And obviously, we're going to see some behaviour problems. So I've listed a few of them here. I've put and more at the end, but horses are going to get stressed. They're going to be anxious. They're going to be constantly thinking, oh, when's someone going to let me out? When are they going to turn me out? So you're going to have horses that become hypervigilant. Horses that are much more reactive to their environment because they're waiting for some environmental cues that tells them food's on its way or you're going to get to go out. These horses are then going to get frustrated. Yeah. And there's only so much frustration a horse can contend with, which might then turn into aggression. So now you've got horses that are potentially lunging and biting at you, even when you perhaps bring them their food. And that's going to become very dangerous. We're going to see horses start resource guarding as well. So this means protecting that food source. And that can link to some of the aggression that we see too. And this might be directed towards the people that are feeding them. It might be directed towards other horses. So now you've got a horse that's become a complete foodie, obsessed with their food. All they can think about is food, and they're very protective of their food. Whilst they're waiting, they're kicking at the door. How annoying is that? Everyone knows how annoying it is. But for the horse, it's getting them attention. Every time they kick that door, someone's shouting at them. If you're a good person and you don't shout at the horse and you just look at them, that's enough attention, unfortunately, to positively reinforce that behaviour and say, well done, you got my attention. If they've got your attention, chances are you might bring them some food. Then they're difficult to handle. You go in the stable and they're aroused, they're frustrated, they're barging out of the door because they can't wait to get out and potentially to a food source. We might see that they redirect those behaviours as well. So it might not always be obvious if your horse develops a behavioural problem that we're seeing something and we're thinking, why is my horse doing that? Why is he nodding his head? Stereotypies that we see, abnormal oral behaviours such as eating weird stuff, chewing wood, raking their teeth up and down the bars, pawing. We've talked about kicking the door. We've talked about aggression, lip smacking, horses flipping their head up and down, twisting and gurning their lips from side to side. Horses will do whatever they can to help them cope with the frustration and the stress that they're feeling. And these coping behaviours can manifest in so many different ways. Depression is unfortunately something that we do see in horses. There's been some research that's come out back 10 years ago already, looking at depression and withdrawn postures in horses. And the general kind of summary is that horses kind of go through where they will act out. We see the intensity of behaviour and frustration increasing. Behaviour becomes louder and bigger and difficult for us to handle. But after a while, the horse will kind of give up and we get to a point of learned helplessness where they've tried everything they can, but within the confines of a stable where they've just perhaps got some bedding and if they're lucky, some forage and I would hope a water bucket, there's not a lot else for them to do. They can't find the food, so they give up and they just shut down and go very quiet. And that's where I think a lot of people mistake their horse is coping. And people say, oh, my horse was ridiculous for 3 weeks. And then after that, he was fine. So that misinterpretation of shut down horses is probably one of the most concerning areas for me as a behaviourist, is not recognising that these horses have given up. They're not suddenly coping. They're not suddenly saying, this is fine. I'm quite happy now. It's no, I just don't know what to do anymore. So I'm just going to wait it out and hope that life gets better. And if that's not enough to convince you, you're probably going to have difficulties training your horses, with riding as well. Behaviour is going to impact on so many different areas. So what can we do about it? Enrichment. And our goal of enrichment is to try and increase that time that we spend of the horses. Sorry, I say we, I mean horses all the time. How long they are feeding for. We want to satisfy that behavioural need, that time budget. So the first port of call is actually understanding what feeding behaviour is. And it's much more than just eating. Think about yourself. It's going shopping, it's preparing your food, it's cooking your food, and then it's the eating the food. So for horses, they want to go and search. They don't just want stuff put in front of them. Oh, thank you, here's my meal. They want to go and explore, search through things, sniff stuff, taste stuff, and select the tastiest things, the goodies, what they like the most. And horses will have different feeding preferences as well, different taste preferences. There's been quite a lot of research looking at different flavours, but also just different types of forages and what horses prefer. Once they find what they want, they need to be able to obtain it quite easily. So some of the enrichment we can use, a lot of the slow feeders make it quite hard to get the food out. And that can be a little bit frustrating. So we've got to be careful there that we're doing the right thing by giving them more food and making them take longer to eat it, but not frustrating them in the process that they get really angry and grumpy. Then we've got the whole biting and chewing, which I've talked about. And then we've got the satisfaction of what they've eaten. So have they spent enough time eating? Do they feel full? And have we satisfied their need for nutrients and calories? Again, there's some interesting research looking at horses given ad lib access to different feed types as to whether they eat for gut fill or whether they eat and select feed for the nutrient and calorie content that it has. So some very interesting information out. I have a few forage tips for you. And I've also got some Wild Horse Welfare ponies kindly donated pictures of in my presentation that you can spot as well. So here's the lovely Paolo. So we can split forage rations rather than just giving your horse their hay all in one go. Move it around, put it in different areas of the stable, different areas of the feed. Put some of it in a net, put some of it on the floor, some of it in a hay ball, whatever it is that you've got access to, or create your own devices as well. Please do offer loose forage as well. Everyone's very worried if they just put hay loose on the floor, the horse is just going to gorge it, eat it all, it's gone very quickly. Yes, they probably will attack that first, but that's also going to satisfy that strong motivation that they have to eat. Allow them to get that food quite quickly, and you'll be surprised that those horses then probably move on to another device. They might not eat all of the loose hay. They might go and then select to eat from something else. So this is going to help control potential frustration. For horses on restricted intake, try and feed low energy forages. So you can have hay sampled, you can have it tested and find out what the nutrient and the energy levels of that feed are, that hay is, sorry. Mix hay with straw. Make sure that you are selecting straw that's of good quality, not horribly dusty, nothing mouldy. So a good quality oat straw is usually a first choice, but there are some barley and wheat straws that might be suitable as well. And soak your hay. So steaming hay is great in terms of health. It helps kill bacteria in the hay, but it doesn't reduce the sugar content by very much. Whereas if we soak hay in cold water and you need to soak it, it depends. Different forages, different grass types will lose their sugar after different amounts of time. Some lose it very quickly, others can take up to 16 hours. So I would advise that you soak it for as long as possible, about 16 hours. The problem there being though that we can see an increase in bacteria, especially if you then hang that hay net out to dry in the sun. We're creating a really nice, warm, moist environment for bacteria to thrive on. So there's pros and cons to both. If on the flip side, you've got a horse that says, I don't want to eat that hay, I like the old hay that you gave me. And I hear this a lot. Or you've changed hay provider, you've got a new batch of hay in, or you've got some lower quality hay and your horse is like, no, I'm on hunger strike, I refuse to eat, which obviously is not a good thing. Try soaking it or getting like a water spray bottle, make some berry tea, some mint tea. You really need 2 or 3 tea bags in there. And spray it on just the outside and you'll be surprised it can work quite well. Have a play with the teas, see what your horse likes. If you're competing, be careful which herbs you put in there. Don't choose things like valerian. So as I said, can be really useful if we use hay nets and slow feeders for horses on restricted rations. We can increase the amount of time that they spend feeding. As we can see in this nice graph here, large hold hay nets, we've got horses that can consume the hay very quickly. If we give them smaller hold hay nets, they're not consuming as much hay. But that can work really nicely when we first do that. We can put hay in double nets. There's lots of different manufactured nets available that you can buy now that are designed to be slow feeders. We've actually seen in this particular study that was also done where I work, was we had horses in our study population that were used to being double netted, some of them triple netted, and they had already adapted how they ate. So when we compared these graphs to some of the published graphs that have done similar studies, we found that our horses actually could consume a lot more hay from the restricted nets than horses in perhaps some of the other studies had. So a lot of the enrichment's great when it's novel and the horse is trying to work it out. Perhaps you've got some form of a bull or another slow feeder, and the horse takes a while to work it out. And then within perhaps a week or two, they've got it stuffed. Horses are smart and it doesn't take them that long to work things out. So you have to monitor that and perhaps change things up a little bit as well. If horses are biting a lot at nets and things, that can wear down their teeth. If we're hanging things up too high, that forms an unnatural feeding position. We can see an increase in neck tension. That's going to cause pain. If horses are having to pull really hard, that's going to create a lot of tension as well. So we might actually see horses getting frustrated that they can't bite very much hay at a time. And also that it's potentially causing pain, and both of those factors could link to aggression as well. And we also have to think about the safety of some of these devices too. I have a few videos, the lovely Paolo. So he has a whole variety of different resources in his stable. So here we've got a box, and you can see he's having to really bite at that to try and get through those very small nets. He's got a little mini net there with a forage brick in it. And on the floor, he's also got a bowl with hay in it, where the hay comes out of several different holes. And in the third video, you can see that he also has a hay net, and he's got plenty of hay on the floor. So we've got several different options here. And you could think that perhaps in that first video, which I'll just play again for you, that could be quite frustrating. If that was his only source of hay, it could. But he's got a large hold hay net as well, and hay on the floor. So I think at this point in time, he's perhaps satisfied his initial urge to stuff his face with some hay. And now perhaps he wants a bit of a challenge. And I've heard this from other people who have a variety of different size hold hay nets for their horses. And they actually find that the horses will leave a large hold hay net or hay on the floor and go to the small hold hay net. So this is your horse perhaps entertaining and enriching themselves a little bit too. Some considerations with enrichment: try and enrich all the senses. Check out, be a bit creative, give some variety. What does your horse like to eat? So we've got a little selection tray. This mare was a little bit, what on earth is this? So a little bit neophobic. She's kind of snatching at food, and she gets the hang of it and takes a whole massive mouthful of all the goodies that are on the tray that she can reach. Make it challenging enough, but not too frustrating. So DIY enrichment can be a really cheap way to do things. If you've got an old cardboard box, putting some hay in it, or an old paper feed bag with some goodies in there, some chopped up carrots and parsnips, is a really fun way for your horse to overcome phobias of novel objects, and also to just access their food in a slightly different way. If you're going to feed horses branches and chopped up logs and things like that, please do check that they are safe for your horse to eat. Not all species of plant are safe. We're very aware of some of the toxicity values of things like sycamore trees and yew trees, for example. Please do monitor your horses for safety as well. Don't leave them alone with certain enrichment devices that could pose a risk to their health. So my final word, because I've talked for a very long time now, is please provide opportunities for those 3 Fs. If that's the only thing you remember from today, is friends, forage, and freedom. Give the horse some choice, some control over what they're doing. Try and enrich their environment so it's more stimulating for them. Fibre first when it comes to your diet. And overall, we're looking to reduce stress and improve well-being so that your horse is happier and you can have a lot more fun with your horse as well. Thank you very much. Just one last slide. Some recommended links there for you to have a look at, which will hopefully appear in the chat as well.
Thank you, Rosa. That was an amazing talk. I think I learned quite a lot there, considering I've been advising people on behaviour and nutrition for many years as a vet. And I think that's exactly the point we're trying to make here, is that it's not just nutrition, is it? We can't just deal with nutrition in isolation, because we're missing the bigger picture. And in terms of the horse's well-being, the behaviour, the welfare is a hugely overlapping part of that, because nutrition and eating is such a big part of a horse's life. So I think you've demonstrated that really nicely there. I love the
Thank
idea,
you.
the box, the ball, and the net as well. I mean, it sounds really silly now, but it's never occurred to me to really tell people to give their horses choice and, you know, make the environment something a bit more like it would be in the wild, which is just such an obvious thing to do. They would have variety, wouldn't they, by out in nature?
Absolutely.
And you certainly busted a lot of myths there, which I think is a nice way to kind of level the playing field amongst all the listeners and the watchers here, is that, you know, there's a lot of things that we need to be aware of out in this subject field, which are simply not true or are misleading. So you kind of put it all now to bed, and we can begin at this level now of trying to build up for the individual horse what they should be doing, which obviously we won't do today for individual basis, but we certainly want to try and give people some rules and some ideas by which they can make their decisions with. So
thank you.
Modern husbandry clearly is so far from what the horses evolved to live in, and we need to be very conscious of that. We've got a few questions that, you know, we've got between us that we've talked about that we really felt were important questions to talk to the audience about and between ourselves. So the first one here for you, Rosa, and after this, just for the rest of you watching, we will go through to the audience questions. So some of that might be covered in these questions and there'll be overlap, and I'll do my best as host to try and avoid overlap. But if we go through these, then I'll come on to the audience questions afterwards. And don't forget, if you're looking at the Q&A, to upvote the questions that already may have addressed the thing you're wanting to ask, and then you can increase its priority, as it were, and I'll go through them in that order. So the first question, aim for you, Rosa. When doing a behaviour consultation, as you do, where does the horse's diet factor in? So obviously somebody might come to you not with a dietary concern, with a behavioural concern. Where does the diet factor in?
So at what point I think about it depends on the nature of the problem, but it's often a really key question when we're taking a case history. I also want to know about any medical issues that may be linked to diet. So if a horse has had laminitis, if it's got insulin resistance, EMS, PSSM, ulcers, tying up, and more. Even just the horse's general demeanour can signpost me to ask more about diet. I'll be looking at their body condition score, asking about levels of exercise as well. And it's not just what they're fed, but it's also how and when they're fed and what their turnout opportunities are, which I think I've explained hopefully by now. So there's actually a lot of information that we need to gather to make up the whole picture. And then when we're formulating a behaviour modification plan, through being certified by the IABC and being accredited by the Animal Behaviour and Training Council, we follow the LEMA protocol, which stands for Least Intrusive Minimally Aversive Procedures, which follows the humane hierarchy. And hopefully there'll be a link popping up in the chat for you to have a look at the IABC's position on this. So the first step that we really need to think about is addressing the well-being of the horse as a starting point. So ensuring that the horse has been seen by a vet to address any underlying health issues that might be causing that behaviour problem, considering pain, considering the role of other paraprofessionals as well. Could be saddle fit, could be something to do with teeth. A lot of oral problems that horses have might be because there are teeth issues. It could be an abscess, it could be uneven teeth, etc. And we're also looking at their management and routine. So as a first port of call, sometimes just changing what and how they're fed and increasing foraging opportunities can make a huge difference to their stress levels, which can actually reduce the behaviour problem, even if it's just like indirectly linked to their feeding. So that's kind of where the diet would factor in for me.
Yeah, so it's kind of almost addressing like a background noise thing, isn't it? It's trying to get rid of a very background stressor that's potentially quite simple to actually address, and then you can tackle more specific problems that clearly will overlap, won't they, in the general.
Exactly that.
Good. And then Justine, a question for you. So have you, and I know you work as an expert consultant and you work in legal disputes, court cases, have you ever had any cases where lack of forage was the cause of the behavioural problem? And I suspect the answer is yes, but maybe you could run through some really good examples of that for us. You're on mute, Justine. That's that's the sort of thing
That's a good start, isn't it? That's a good start. Yes, absolutely. A lack of forage is the cause or a contributing factor, I'm going to say, in most of the cases that I see, to be honest. It is a huge problem. Actually, in 2018, for a conference presentation I was doing, I reviewed 100 of my cases. When I go out and see a case, I send the client a questionnaire to ask about the horse's management. So I've got quite a lot of data about how horses are fed and the nature of behavioural problems and how that affects them. And I found that 42 of the 100 cases were going more than 8 hours without food. So even going back to what Rosa is saying and our concerns about potentially horses having gastric ulcers, I think this is a massive problem. Yes, massive range of behaviour problems in horses and ponies of all disciplines. And that could be from Grand Prix sport horses worth hundreds of thousands of pounds to a children's pony. Probably the most direct, the behaviour problem that is most related to lack of forage is going to be aggression or anxiety about food, or horses potentially resource guarding food. I've seen one horse that actually the owners would put a bale of haylage in the field, and the pony would actually go and stand on top of it and prevent anybody else from getting it. You know, and this is because they've been deprived in the past, or they're not given enough food currently. This is so valuable to them. They really feel like they've got to defend that. But a huge issue is, let's say, ponies that will drag their children to grass, or I've seen horses that will come out the stable and bolt to the field. So we've got handling problems related to them being to having food restricted. But also, I think it's a contributing factor in a huge range of problems. I've seen a very smart competition horse that self-mutilated, and part of his problem was a very restricted diet. He was getting a very small hay net morning and evening, and very, very large hard feeds 3 times a day. And then we could go on to things like ridden problems that could be caused by gastric ulcers, which could be down to restricted forage. Also, if forage is restricted and somebody wants to use food rewards in training, then horses can get very frustrated about that. So if anybody's thinking about using food in training, which I absolutely would recommend, it is really important to look at that, to look at their food management beforehand and ensure that they're relaxed about food. And that can be to do with food delivery or timing. I'm just trying to, and the other thing, of course, is if they are restricted in their diet, we can see a general rise in anxiety, I think. Rosa might have something else. I'm also thinking stereotypies. I think Rosa had a really interesting case of
Rosa, do you want to add that quickly? Do you want to comment?
Yes, happy to. I think, yes, some stereotypies, they're the hard one, because a lot of horses you might take on already have a stereotypy, and upping the forage doesn't necessarily help. There's a lot more to stereotypies than just boredom or lack of forage. So probably one I won't go into tonight because it is a humongous topic. But I think the frustration levels and people taking shortcuts as well. So especially in winter, like preparing morning nets and things like that, and then leaving them outside the horse's stable. So the horses finish their hay net and can see the hay net for the morning outside the stable. That's increasing frustration. Then I see that linking to aggression and horses nipping and grabbing at people. And also at feed time, the difference in behaviour between horses that are waiting for hard feed or waiting for forage, and the intensity of some of those anticipatory behaviours that we see can become quite dangerous as well. Injuries to horses because of some of those things too. So yeah, I think Justine and I could probably list on and on and on and on and on and on.
No, but I think that's a good point, isn't it? Because we always try to, and I'm sure all owners do, try and look at it from the horse's perspective. And that's not the same thing as anthropomorphizing, is it? We'll be careful that we're not anthropomorphizing. It's learning what matters to the horse and what stresses the horse, what makes the horse happy, in inverted commas. And you know, and I think you touched on the disciplines thing there as well, don't you, Justine? And that's very true, that I think it's easy to assume all high performance horses must be stressed and poorly managed and poorly fed, which isn't always the case. I know there are patterns, but you know, equally you could have as much dietary stressors in a happily retired pony out at grass that might have other forms of stress coming from its management. So I think it's important not to get into glass houses, as it were, and throw stones at other disciplines, because I think every potential horse and situation has the potential to go wrong from a dietary and behavioural point.
That's a really important point. Absolutely.
Yeah. Because you hear it a lot, don't you? Well, race horses are in their stable all day, so they get ulcers. And, you know, my horse lives out at grass all day, so he's obviously must be very happy. But of course, it's not that simple.
And I was going to say, actually, there are a lot of racehorse owners that will give massive amounts of forage, and it will be on the floor, and they will have hay nets, and they are very good at it. Is I think it is a problem with social media that people will criticize a particular discipline. Yeah. There are problems across the board.
Tarring with the same brush. Yeah, and exactly. And it's not just about the food. There's enrichment as a whole, which obviously I know we're concentrating on the dietary bit, but yeah, there's a lot more to it, isn't it? And I think we should remember that. Which leads us on to a nice question for the pair of you, really. And I'll come to you first, Rosa, if that's all right. Do you see many behaviour problems in relation to food? Yes, I know you've just said that, but could you run through sort of specific ones that you can isolate to the food? I know you've just touched on some, like the aggression and things like that. But give us a couple more examples if you can.
Yes, try not to repeat what I've already said, but it's mostly the frustration and stress, and it's hard to pinpoint specific behaviours beyond that list, because it is so individual to a horse's coping mechanism and to what's perhaps available for them in that environment as to what behaviour they might start to perform. So horses that are food deprived might crib, might weave, might box walk. But why a horse chooses to do one over the other, we don't necessarily know the answers to that yet. Why might one horse start flapping and nodding its head and flapping its lips and then keep doing that? Might be because the sound of that lip flapping is a bit reinforcing for them. So I think we know that horses learn through trial and error. They try a behaviour out, and perhaps it reduces their arousal. It gives them some form of positive feedback. Perhaps it reduces some dopamine. Perhaps it's a self-calming behaviour. So what works for a horse is going to be what they're going to do. And I'm not trying to avoid the question, but it's really hard to list everything that's possibly out there. And it's not just lack of forage where we see problems with feeding, it's also looking at horses fed high starch and sugar diets. And we see a lot of problems caused through this as well. So we see the clinical issues that are caused by high starch diets, but then there's the symptoms that those horses show because perhaps they're in pain or they're uncomfortable as a result of having ulcers or having inflammation in their feet. And then we recognise those as behaviour problems. If a horse is bucking, it could be for multiple different reasons, but that could be because of a dietary beginning because of that. Horses on high starch diets get really excited about feed time. They're often more anxious, more reactive to their environment, and then they're more susceptible to other things becoming stressful. And then we see this kind of cascade where they're not coping very well. Everything now is pretty arousing to them, and then they're having to develop other coping mechanisms to deal with that. So this makes it really hard as a behaviourist to try and work out what it is that a horse is doing, even just the resource guarding as well. Sorry,
it's really tricky. No, sorry, I was only going to say, because I think, Justine, you touched on this, it's this, there's sometimes as well you've picked up on, or the owners picked up on the issue quite late on, or at least the problems become quite manifested. So presumably unpicking the multiple layers of the current behaviour that's being displayed could have a whole history, couldn't it? From weaning to when it was young and being broken in, to when it was stabled for a period of time, you know. So presumably, Justine, every case is hugely different, which is why we struggle so much to give out general advice.
Absolutely. Rosa's made a brilliant point there, just about food presentation, and it just made me think about a case that I saw some years ago, where a mare had been incredibly aggressive and for over 2 years, and the owner was about to get kicked off her yard, and because the mare was aggressive over her stable door. She would lunge at anybody walking past, and she'd actually hospitalized one of the grooms who'd been walking past. I won't go into the details of the case, we'll be here all night, but to cut a very long story short, the issue was actually not that she didn't have enough forage, but that she had a very small hold hay net, and she was so frustrated about it that every time somebody walked past, the only thing that she could redirect on was somebody in her vicinity. And as soon as we took the forage ration out of the hay net and put it on the floor, we never saw the behaviour again. So there are, I know Rosa's touched on this, but yeah, just a plethora of diet related, actually related to the type of food that we're giving, as Rosa said, the differences between hard feed and forage, but also how it's presented. Also, I was going to say that this is a very difficult time of year for a lot of horse owners and a lot of horses. If they're stabled, I know I must say that a lot of horse owners really struggle with yards putting restrictions on them as to how much they can turn out. So we're going to end up with horses that aren't going to get grazing, to be able to graze as much as they should. But also some yards will put restriction on how much hay or haylage a horse can have. They might only provide one form of hay, one form of forage ration. They might not want haylage on the yard. They might not want hay on the yard. And I do meet a lot of horse owners that know that they're not doing the best for their horse, but their hands are tied, and it's really, really hard for them.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think, owners can sometimes trying their very best, but there are lots of restrictions, aren't there? And I think the key is there's a wealth of options out there, and actually there might be some hopefully tonight that people hadn't thought of, as I think we're probably in your presentation, Rosa. I think it's probably a good time, because we're 8 o'clock now, to go to the audience questions. I'm amazed by the array of locations we've got amongst the audience. I mean, we've got Canada, multiple states in America. I mean, almost every country in Europe, it appears, from Spain, Bulgaria, Portugal. We've got Brazil, we've got Mexico, we've got, all the states, all the counties in the UK. So hopefully quite a broad spectrum of people, and I'm sure different management systems as well. I mean, even in the UK, we have different ways of managing horses, different weather and different grasses, different access to different forages. So you've got to sort of assess what's around you and what your environment's like. I'm going to go through these questions, and I'm going to start with the most upvoted ones. So bear with me, and I apologize to people if I slightly paraphrase them incorrectly. I'm trying to, not overlap with things we've already said, but actually address particularly these ones that have got significant numbers of votes that people must be very, very concerned about. So one of our first questions here, if your horse is stabled overnight, how can you provide regular foraging when a hay net only lasts a certain amount of time without overfeeding? So obviously this is the case that you have got to be careful about overfeeding, presumably weight-wise. How can you provide that regular forage, that trickle feeding, I suppose? Rosa, would you like to go first and answer that question?
Sure. So hopefully you're already concocting answers from what I presented on earlier, is really probably finding as low value energy forage as possible. So we're talking about the megajoules of digestible energy here, and you're not going to know from looking at your hay, and hay can be confusing. It can look really high quality and it's not, and vice versa. So we're going for that later cut hays, speaking to the farmer that you get your hay from, and asking for the later cut hay that's going to be a bit more stemmy and stalky and lower in nutritional value. Soaking that hay probably for, if you can, overnight, 12 to 16 hours is ideal. And then putting it in different types of feeders. So if you can, put at least a little bit on the floor so they can get that initial, when they first get their hay, bite some of that, have some of it in a larger hold hay net, a small hold hay net, and other devices that you can come up with. So there are so many. If you just search for slow feeders on the internet, people have been really creative, and there's more and more things coming through now. There are some great devices out there, and some things that you can make as well.
And I think
so hopefully that helps.
That was my take-home message, actually, from what you said, was that don't just assume there's one to choose from. Yeah, or sorry, one choice to make, I should say. You know, don't buy one type of slow feeder, maybe buy a couple, and it's a good investment at the end of the day if it works. And giving them that initial bit of forage that's more free access, really, and then trickle feeding them afterwards. That makes complete sense when you think about the behavioural needs as well as the physiological needs.
It does make a big difference. I've seen it with horses who have just had small hold hay nets, and they're literally attacking you as you walk in with the hay net, and people using the hay net as a shield, literally, because the horse is so over aroused and frustrated that actually just giving them some of that ration on the floor, yes, they might eat it really fast, but just gets that initial arousal and frustration level down.
Yeah, absolutely. And they haven't got huge stomachs, so they're not going to potentially gorge themselves too much, are they? It's going to be a portion of their ration, if you like, that they're going to eat a little bit too quickly, but then they'll trickle the rest, hopefully.
Yeah.
And you say that creates a nice, good behavior, doesn't it, as opposed to adverse ones. Good. And then our next question is from Hannah. Do the majority of horses really self-regulate their forage, which in brackets the hay grass intake, if they have 24 access to forage? So do they have that ability to self-regulate? That's a good question.
That is a really good question. And do you know, I'm really not sure I've got the answer to that. I think some of them do. And I think certainly if they've been deprived, I think that we will get, as Rosa mentioned, we will get rebound behaviours, but in some of them, I think that can go on for months. And so I think we do need to restrict what they're given or their access to grazing. That's a really tough question. I don't know, actually, Rosa, have you got any thoughts on that one?
It is a good question. And, you know, when you read the research papers, sometimes their populations are quite small. They might be in a very niche group of horses and not always representative of all horses. So we might find that it does say that the horses will regulate themselves perhaps after a 3-week period. But that's also 3 weeks where they've been eating too much, and that's a lot of time to cause some serious problems. So I think we do need to manage it and help our horses. And some horses will just continue to eat as much as they possibly can, whether that's a conditioned response in them, as we see. And so I think Justine's comments are absolutely right there. I don't think we know the definite answer, and I'm always a bit too worried to just give the horses a complete free-for-all. So some of those management tips to slow things down and eat things out are probably going to be better to try. But you've also got to bear in mind fluctuating nutrition levels in your grazing as well. So springtime, hugely high, like some grass can be 14, 16 megajoules of energy, which is equivalent to feeding them a race mix.
Wow.
In the winter, it's right down to 6 megajoules of energy. This is rough figures, which is very low and worse than perhaps some of the very low energy hay and chaffs that you can get. So you've got to be aware of all of these different factors, which is, if you don't have the answers, speak to a nutritionist, because they do know this stuff and they can give you that right advice. So you're not on your own trying to work it all out. And don't even talk about the maths or rationing, because that's even harder for my little brain.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, is that, you know, you're not going to be able to implement one type of management system for the rest of your horse's life. This is a really, you've got to be really agile and mobile and amenable to making changes constantly throughout the year, from year to year, throughout the horse's aging process. So there's absolutely no way you can learn in a few sessions what you need to know to implement with your horse today. You're going to have to keep learning. And obviously we're all still learning. I mean, the whole field, the research side of things is constantly evolving as well. So I think that's the key. If you're going to go to the effort of having a horse, you know, invest time and energy into learning this stuff and seeking the right advice. Exactly that. Do not just assume you can learn it yourself and that's it, done and dusted. You know, you've got to keep evolving with the horse. So this is another good example. I mean, it's not specific advice to the horse, but this is an example of a group of horses, I guess, which this can become an issue, where you've got a horse that's got either poor, no teeth, and that doesn't have to just be older horses, of course, horses that have lost teeth for other reasons potentially, and you're feeding things like mashes, fast fibers, all these other kind of soakable fibers, I suppose, as the main fiber ration, they're not chewing, are they, Rosa? And as you mentioned in your talk, you know, chewing is really important. I mean, they are chewing, but not perhaps as much as they would be where they've got more of that lignin, that silica kind of basis in their feed. What can you suggest that might help those? Because that's a really good point, which I've actually confessed not thought about with my cases.
I don't know that I know the answer to it, but my thoughts on this would be that if they've got no teeth, we're not so worried about the silica because we don't need to wear the teeth down anymore, although it's often front teeth that go first, and they're really just for biting. So long as the horse can get the food in its mouth, they can still be chewing with those back teeth. Now, saliva production is a big part of the lubrication that I talked about. So if we've got a wet feed, we're not so worried about choking things because the feed's wet enough. What we would be then worried about is the saliva production not being there to produce the bicarb to buffer the acid in the stomach. However, most feeds that we would give as a mash, and you can buy soakable products, as you mentioned in the question, a lot of other feeds you can get, things like sugar beet and alfalfa that can be soaked, and even some of the high fiber cubes, you can just soak those and make quite a nice mash out of them. They're much better than a brown mash. A brown mash doesn't have the best nutrition for horses, and certainly not balanced. It has a very inverse calcium to phosphorus ratio, so doesn't do your horse too many favours. You're better off to soak something like a high fibre cube. We don't need to worry about those as much because they're all quite high fibre products, that they shouldn't be producing so much of an acid issue in the gut. So when perhaps not satisfying the horse's need to chew, I'm not sure what the answer would be around that. Perhaps satisfying the time for them searching. But again, when it comes to devices that you put a mash in, you're a little bit stumped there as well. So someone needs to be creative and come up with some solutions for this.
Yeah.
I don't know if Justine's got some ideas.
No, I really haven't. And you know, that's something I've never come across and I've never considered. So
I think enriching environments in other ways, I guess, could be another answer, isn't it? Like producing a varied environment for them to enjoy company and for owner interaction. You know, I think we forget that, particularly with the retired horses, you don't have to ride your horse to interact. There's lots of other ways to interact. Grooming is a great one, isn't it? So maybe you have to try and think of other enrichment and sort of welfare, fulfilling kind of ways to cope. And I know the question was about saliva, so that's tricky and we probably can't help with that hugely, but there's other ways to hopefully address other stressors, I suppose, would be the way to summarize that, wouldn't it? We've got another good question here. What approaches can we use to manage food anxiety for rescue horses? And I know you've both talked about this a little bit, particularly in rescue horses that have got a high body condition score. So they need to be losing weight as opposed to those where you might be trying to gain their weight. So what would you do for those?
I was going to say the first thing I would suggest actually is looking. I know I anticipated a question about horses needing to lose weight and want to recommend having a look at Tamsin Furtado's brilliant weight management guide, and there should be a link. There should be a link for that. But thinking about food anxiety. In most cases, this is going to be because the horse or pony has had their forage or their food ration restricted in the past, or they've been starved, they've been underweight, they've gone for long periods of time without food. So to deal with that, really, we want the horse to have relatively constant access to high fiber food, as Rosa suggested. If we are trying to keep the weight down, then it's going to have to be soaked, as Rosa suggested. But we can provide variety and choice by you could soak in herb teas to provide different flavors. If you're going to put rations on the floor, if you're going to put part of their ration on the floor, you could scatter some food through it. I'm going to say chopped fruit and veg, like cucumber, you can put berries in, you can put courgette in, you can give them celery. Rosa's mentioned turnip and swede. There are lots and lots of things to provide different flavors for them that can provide a bit of variety. But I think the key is as much fiber as you can that's going to be high fiber, low calorie, and they need to feel confident that food is always going to be available, and not boring. I think that's the issue, and this is where we've got to, as Rosa said, try and get creative. How can we make that food ration more interesting for them? So thinking about different flavors is probably the way to go.
Rose, have you got anything to add to that you'd like to make sure people know?
I think Justine's answered that really nicely.
Yeah, I think what struck me when you mentioned the Tamsin's paper or document, I suppose, is that kind of enriching the environment again, isn't it? Getting them moving and walking and interacting with other horses, track systems, you know, put food in different places they've got to get from the water to the food, and vary the area, have a grooming area, a loafing area, and by grooming I mean a kind of groom brush kind of area like they do for some cattle. There's lots of other things to think about, isn't there? So they're not just having to eat all the time to satisfy themselves. They've got other things to choose from other than eating, even though they clearly will eat all the time.
and Rosa's brilliant films of just thinking about creative ways for presenting the food at different heights, in different hold nets, or there are great slow feeders available, and hay pillows, things like that. And some of those locale bricks are brilliant to put in a little hay net for them. Yeah,
definitely. So and the next very voted question is, what are some reasons why horses will dunk their hay into their water buckets? And I remember this happening a lot in racing yards where I worked at. I don't know if that was a coincidence, because I've come across it in other non-racing horses, but would one of you, I don't know, Rose, would you like to describe that one first? What's your opinion?
We had a mare that used to do this. I call her the serial dunker, because we'd have to give her own bucket to soak her hay in, because otherwise she couldn't really drink it. And it's actually a valid point. I think it's just a feeding preference. I don't think anyone's got a specific reason why they do this. Perhaps they just like it a bit more moist. Maybe some of you like more gravy on your dinner. And they've learned, perhaps through dropping their hay in their water and then eating it, that's quite tasty. It's quite nice for them. It might be easier for them to chew. It might make it softer. It might make it smell better. I don't know if that opens up pores and releases some more smell, but it is important that you do provide one bucket for them to drop their hay in, and a fresh bucket of water for them to drink, because again, we're going to see an increase in bacteria from that hay sort of sitting there and fermenting a bit, especially when it's really warm weather. So do change that quite frequently. What was quite interesting was we had a gelding who was by the same sire as this mare, and I heard him in his stable. All I could hear was him getting water, and then just water slopping everywhere. And he had the wrong idea. He would take a mouthful of water and then walk to his hay net and try and take a mouthful of hay with the water still in his mouth, and it was just dropping all over the floor. So he hadn't quite worked out which order to do the soaking hay in.
Can I just anything to add?
Yeah, I was just brilliant answer from Rosa, as always. But I was just going to say, I have seen horses who have only dunked their haylage if it's been a specific batch, and I do wonder if it might be more acidic, perhaps. I'm really interested that you said on racing yards, because I'm thinking about ulcers, and I'm just wondering if it might be more comfortable for them to eat if they've got GI upset. So I don't know the answer, but I have certainly seen horses do it with some batches of haylage. And my thought then might be that it would be more acidic, and they're getting rid of that batches of haylage. So it's not a habit for them, as it were.
No, that's a really good point. And then we haven't got long left, so I'm going to quickly go through a few of the remaining questions, or at least try and touch on their subject areas. So one is which is about people taking their horses for gastroscopy. So for those that don't know, if you take your horse to be scoped for ulcers, normally that's the common cause why you might take your horse to a vet to be scoped. you have to starve the horse overnight to empty the stomach so we can look at the stomach. So that naturally is not a great thing to do. We don't want horses having empty stomachs, but I suppose from my point of view, it's a necessary evil to get to that diagnostic part. But you certainly wouldn't want to do it routinely. But I think temporary one-off starving episodes, we would hope, don't create ulcers overnight. Would you agree with that, both of you, that it's more a persistent, recurrent, habitual problem that it can happen? Now, we do know ulcers can occur quite quickly over time. I think we're talking days, weeks, definitely. But I think a one-off to get a horse scoped, people perhaps ought to relax. I think the most stressful bit about that is probably the horse banging at the door and calling for its food, which is why it's sometimes easier to take the horse to the hospital the night before, so you don't have to deal with that, because I know that's something people struggle with. Any comments on that? Maybe you could use other behavioural enrichment to distract them from that lack of food that evening and that morning. Would you agree?
Yeah, make sure they've got company. You could, I'm trying to think, can they have water? They can't have water. Can they have water?
Can have water, yeah. Flavoured water was something
I was going to say, yeah, could we give them flavoured water, or could we?
And the novelty of that might be quite fun for them if it's the first time they've had it as well. It might really occupy them for the sort of overnight period. It's
and some herb teas, cooled herb teas. They love raspberry leaf. They love red berries and rose hip. Chamomile might be useful.
Yeah.
I think just trying to minimize stress. When we look at sort of formation of gastric ulcers, it's often multifactorial. So not just necessarily the one stressor of being starved, but the transport stress as well. So if you can travel them with a companion, if you can provide a companion, and it might sound silly, but even a fake horse, like a plastic horse, can be a really good substitute. And I know that some vet clinics are starting to use these as well in another stable where there perhaps isn't another horse available. Just try and stick with their normal routine and do the things that you would do with them, and spend time with them and groom them, and just try and keep it low stress for them if possible.
And then the last question I'm really desperate to squeeze in before we wrap up is just horses with stereotypies, where they start to crib or weave at the time of feeding. Might seem like an obvious answer now, we've learned everything. What would your sort of one sentence be? I suppose, sorry to rush you both, but Justine, you go. What would you say for someone that's struggling with that? What's your...
I mean, my first thought is try and avoid one-off feeding times, so that you would be staggering feed throughout the day and food would always be available. Absolutely, if they're going to, if we've got a food event, they're going to get very aroused about that. And I know that there's a concern that there's a link between them potentially eating hard feed, it feeling uncomfortable in their stomach, and them going and cribbing to produce saliva to try and buffer that. So I think try and reduce those big feed events would be my first thought.
Management change. Yeah, Rosa, any one line of advice for those? Same thing, or?
Yeah. If you can't do that because you're stuck on a yard where they dictate the feeding times, feed those horses first. Don't make them wait, and don't expect them to behave because you've made them wait as a punishment. It doesn't really work. So just get the food in as quick as possible.
Yeah, agreed. So take home message. I want one from each of you. In the meantime, while you're thinking, I'm just going to remind everybody to email education@worldhorsewelfare.org with any suggestions for topics for future webinars. I'd like all people watching, if you can, to complete the NUC Cost of Living Horsekeepers Survey, which closes at the end of this month on the 31st of January. It's a really good opportunity to get your voice heard in relation to the cost of living and how it's impacting horse owners. There'll be a link to that in the chat, and you can also go to the NUC website to find that. Anyone seeking a registered behaviourist, please use the link to the Animal Behaviour and Training Council. Again, link in the chat. And our next webinar is on the 1st of February on targeted parasite control to take best care of your horse and the environment, to inform you about wellbeing programs, pasture management, and valuable discussion on sort of wider environmental issues. So now I'm going to go to you, Rosa. What's your one take-home message?
Eat more fibre. So all the F's, fibre and the 3 F's, just please remember those, and do what you can. Even just a tiny little change for your horse can make a huge difference to them, and improve their well-being.
Yeah, absolutely. Looking at the bigger picture as well, isn't it? So, yeah. And you, Justine, what's your one bit of parting advice for everyone watching?
I think provide choice and variety for them. And, you know, it can be really tough for horse owners that we can have a lot of restrictions as to how we keep them. But if we really think about how we can improve turnout, we can give them a good social life, we can improve their quality of life. And I would ask everybody to start thinking about the horse's mental health, not just their physical health.
Yeah, agreed. And I think that's a really good point. It's easy to forget that part, isn't it, as horse owners and vets and everyone. So we need to, and I think that summarizes nicely my sort of bullet points that I've been scribbling down here, which I would wish I'd had while I was working in practice, but I'll try and put to good use now with my job at Beaver. Is that, you know, forget the idea of meals, forget the idea of this sort of human way of feeding ourselves. You know, horses are completely different. You know, we enjoy as humans making feeds, buying different foods. Your horse's needs are actually very different from those which satisfy us as humans. So we need to remove ourselves from the picture, you know, admitting that there's challenges, I know, with livery yards where you don't have control, but for the bits you can control as a horse owner, concentrate on those and really try and concentrate on the horse's needs, not your own. And we've looked at, you know, huge amounts of variation, choice, keeping that low energy feedstuffs and forages, using straw, which I know for years we panicked about colic and things like that. There's very little evidence to say that horses will colic off straw if they've got no previous histories of colic and no reason why they won't manage straw, so dental issues. And it's an overlooked source of good forage, I would say, that satisfies that need to be chewing and eating. And that need to adapt and evolve throughout not just different horses and different stages of horse ownership, but through your horse's life and from season to season. So respond to those little changes that your horse needs you to make. And I know that there's issues with livery yards, particularly in the UK. And I think education is key to trying to get that message out there to those that are responsible for the yards, managing yards. And I think as owners and hopefully any yard managers that are listening, we can do that as a team and we can work together. And I think if we keep singing from the same hymn sheet, then we can only make our horses' lives better with regards to how we meet their needs in terms of nutrition, diet, feeding, and day-to-day behaviour. So I'd just like to thank everybody for coming today. There's been a huge amount of questions, and I'm really sorry we didn't get through them all, but there were literally dozens. In fact, I think it could have got much higher than that looking at the numbers. So clearly a popular topic. And I urge you all to use the links. You'll be able to watch the recording on YouTube. So don't worry, none of this is going to disappear, as it were. You'll still be able to access the information. And I'd love to thank the speakers. Rosa, Justine, you've been fantastic. And of course, World Horse Welfare. I know there's an awful lot of work that goes on behind the scenes to make these webinars happen. And they churn them out. And it's really one of the most powerful things that we can do for the horses under our care is to learn and to keep educating ourselves. We're all students in this game. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Lucy.
Rosa, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.